Before dawn on June 25, 1950, artillery opened along the 38th parallel and North Korean forces crossed into the south. Tanks, infantry, and aircraft moved down roads that had been political lines only a few years earlier. Seoul was less than 40 miles from the frontier. For civilians hearing guns in the distance, the Cold War was no longer a phrase about speeches, spies, and rival systems. It had become columns of soldiers, collapsing bridges, refugee roads, and the first major shooting war of the nuclear age. Korea had not been divided because Koreans asked for division. For decades, the peninsula had lived under Japanese colonial rule. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Allied planners needed a quick way to accept surrender north and south of a line. The 38th parallel became that line. Soviet forces entered the north, American forces entered the south. What began as an administrative convenience hardened into a political frontier because the post-war world was already splitting into hostile camps. The division tore through a country with its own politics, hopes, fears, and factions. In the north, Kim Il-sung built a communist state backed by Moscow and later connected to Mao's new China. In the south, Syngman Rhee led an anti-communist republic supported by the United States. Both governments claimed legitimacy over all Korea. Both used coercion. Both lived with border raids, insurgency, and bitter memories from occupation and civil violence. The war that began in 1950 was therefore both a Korean Civil War and an international Cold War crisis. The evidence from the opening days is clear on the military fact. North Korean forces attacked south across the parallel on June 25. Their Soviet-made T-tanks gave them a striking advantage over South Korean units that lacked comparable armor and heavy weapons. The Republic of Korea Army fought in places, fell back in others, and struggled to communicate under pressure. Seoul's position near the border made the danger immediate. By June 28, North Korean forces had entered the capital. The collapse created scenes that still define the war's first phase. Refugees poured south with bundles, carts, children, and livestock. Soldiers tried to distinguish enemy infiltrators from desperate civilians, a terrible problem that produced fear and, in some cases, atrocities. Bridges, rail lines, and roads became military objectives and human choke points. The war was never only a movement of arrows on a map. It was a social disaster unfolding through families and villages as state power broke over ordinary life. Washington faced a question that went beyond Korea. President Harry Truman and his advisors believed the attack tested whether armed aggression could be contained after the Second World War. The memory of appeasement in the 1930s shaped their thinking, but so did the new United Nations system. The Soviet delegate was absent from the Security Council because of a dispute over China's seat. That absence allowed the Council to condemn the invasion and call for assistance to South Korea. The United States then chose intervention under a United Nations flag. That decision mattered because it made Korea a test case for collective security, not simply a bilateral American war. Forces from many countries would eventually serve under the UN command, though the United States carried the largest burden. Truman framed the action as a police action, a phrase that never matched the suffering on the ground. For soldiers, pilots, sailors, nurses, and civilians, it was war in every practical sense. The first American ground troops entered combat underprepared. Task Force Smith, rushed from occupation duty in Japan, met North Korean armor near Asan in early July. The unit fought hard but could not stop the advance. Its experience became a warning about what happens when assumptions, budgets, training, and readiness fail before a crisis arrives. The United States had atomic weapons and global ambitions, but in Korea it also needed infantry, artillery, logistics, weather endurance, and units able to hold ground. By late summer 1950, UN and South Korean forces had been pushed into the Pusan perimeter in the southeast corner of the peninsula. Their geography, supply, naval support, and desperate defense slowed the North Korean drive. The perimeter was not a neat line on a classroom map. It was a tense ring of hills, rivers, roads, ports, exhausted troops, and civilians caught near the last major foothold. If Pusan fell, organized resistance on the peninsula might collapse. Then the war reversed. In September, General Douglas MacArthur launched an amphibious landing at Incheon, a risky port with severe tides and difficult approaches. The operation succeeded beyond expectation. UN forces cut North Korean supply lines, recaptured Seoul, and drove the invading army back. The victory restored confidence, but it also changed the political question. Was the goal simply to restore South Korea, or to destroy the North Korean regime and unify the peninsula by force? UN forces crossed north of the 38th parallel and advanced toward the Yalu River near China. Warnings came that the People's Republic of China might intervene if hostile forces approached its border. The exact timing and interpretation of those warnings have been debated, but the strategic danger was real. In late 1950, Chinese forces entered the war in massive numbers. The front surged south again. The fighting around the Chosin Reservoir became a brutal symbol of cold, isolation, and survival under pressure. Korea forced American leaders to define limited war. The United States had nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union had tested its own atomic bomb in 1949. A wider war could draw in China, the Soviet Union, and perhaps Europe. MacArthur wanted a more aggressive approach against China. Truman insisted on civilian control and limited objectives. When Truman removed MacArthur in 1951, the decision was controversial, but it clarified a constitutional and strategic point. In the nuclear age, battlefield success could not be separated from escalation risk. After the front stabilized near the 38th parallel, the war became a grinding conflict of hills, patrols, artillery, prisoners, negotiations, and endurance. Names such as Heartbreak Ridge and Pork Chop Hill carried the cost of fighting for ground whose political value was measured in bargaining position and defensive depth. The talks dragged on because prisoner repatriation, boundaries, and verification all carried ideological meaning. Soldiers kept dying while diplomats argued over the terms of stopping. The armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. It stopped the shooting, but it did not create a peace treaty. A demilitarized zone cut across the peninsula. South Korea survived and eventually became a prosperous democracy after decades of authoritarian rule, protest, development, and reform. North Korea survived as a militarized communist state under the Kim family. Families remained divided. Prisoners, refugees, and the missing became part of a human ledger no armistice could close. Casualty estimates vary by category and source, but the scale was immense. Millions of Korean civilians were killed, wounded, displaced, or bereaved. Military deaths included South Korean, North Korean, Chinese, American, and other UN command forces. Cities were bombed and rebuilt. Villages changed hands. The trauma lived on in memory, politics, and education. Calling Korea the Forgotten War may describe American popular memory, but it can sound strange on a peninsula where the consequences never ended. The Korean War also remade the Cold War. It strengthened the American security commitment in East Asia, accelerated rearmament, deepened the US-Japan alliance, and fixed Korea at the center of global containment policy. It gave the United Nations one of its earliest and most consequential military tests. It showed communist powers were not a single simple bloc, even when they fought on the same side. It also showed that local conflicts could become global crises when ideology, alliance credibility, borders, and nuclear weapons converged. For Korea itself, the war's origin still matters because it shaped two states with radically different futures. The South's survival was not guaranteed in June 1950. The North's decision to invade did not produce quick unification. It produced devastation and permanent militarization. The armistice line became one of the most heavily guarded borders on Earth. Families separated by that line grew old under rival governments that told different histories about the same war. June 25, 1950, therefore belongs to more than Korean history. It is a warning about provisional lines becoming permanent frontiers, about civil conflict inviting outside powers, about leaders misjudging speed and resolve, and about the difficulty of ending a war once maximum goals replace limited aims. It also shows why alliances are not abstractions. They are tested in hours of confusion, on roads full of refugees, and in decisions made before anyone knows how large the war will become. The Korean War began with an invasion across a line drawn in haste after an empire fell. It continued because rival Korean states, superpowers, the United Nations, and China all treated the peninsula as a place where the future balance of power might be decided. It ended only in an armistice, leaving a divided country and an unfinished peace. That is why the first day still matters. The Cold War turned hot in Korea, and the fire never fully went out.